Margaret Thatcher, who has died today, Baroness Thatcher, universally known I think still as Mrs Thatcher, was the most extraordinary politician in Britain probably since 1945. That's not to say that other Prime Ministers such as Clement Attlee and indeed Tony Blair haven't had a profound influence on Britain, and perhaps in many ways Attlee more influence on Britain. But Mrs Thatcher was the first ever female British PM, an extraordinary achievement. She was Prime Minister for a longer period than anybody else since the early part of the 19th century, and she won elections with huge majorities in 1983 and 1987. She dominated the way the country was run, dominated her cabinet. Having said that, she didn't start out as Mrs Thatcher, the progenitor of Thatcherism. Thatcherism grew as she was in power. Remembering at the beginning of her period in office in 1980 and 81, Sir Geoffrey Howe, her Chancellor, introduced radical budgets that cut public expenditure, reduced taxation as well, and started a very different version of Britain, including removing subsidies from state-controlled industries, which of course eventually led to the huge clash with the miners in 1984. And all of that approach to industrial policy, to reducing taxes, to reducing public expenditure, came to be seen as a Thatcherite approach, and over time described as Thatcherism. What did that boil down to? Well, an attempt to make Britain more pro-business, to have a smaller public sector, lower taxes, to deliver a very different economy than the one that had been inherited from Jim Callaghan and the Labour Party in 1979, remembering at the time Britain had not only relatively slow economic growth, but was seen to have terrific difficulties with trades unions, which Mrs Thatcher was committed to do something about. It's worth pausing, of course, to say that Labour had themselves tried to sort out trade unions and labour relations. Barbara Castle in particular had tried to do that, but hadn't been able to get as far as she, Barbara Castle, wanted to. Mrs Thatcher continued that process in a rather more, obviously, actually in many people's view, much more aggressive way than Barbara Castle and Labour might have done. Beyond that, Mrs Thatcher was originally pro-European. She's now seen as being anti-European, but actually she fought for Britain to stay in the European community in 1975 when there was a referendum. But latterly, and certainly as Prime Minister, was seen as the leader of a sort of Britain, a policy for Britain to get its money back, for powers to be repatriated, and generally for a more sceptical tone on Europe, which has, I think, influenced and indeed arguably harmed the Conservative Party's cohesion ever since, and certainly influenced the wider debate in Britain in the longer term. In 1982, Mrs Thatcher faced the Argentine General Galtieri's invasion of the Falkland Islands. At the time, Conservatives were unpopular, although Labour was not having its finest hour at that point. The Conservatives were doing badly in opinion polls, but the conflict in the Falklands and indeed Britain's defeat of the Argentine hugely helped Mrs Thatcher's popularity and helped to drive her back into office in 1983 and then helped her again in 1987, left Labour on the sidelines of politics for a very long time. Labour reformed in all of this time. Mrs Thatcher influenced the way Labour politicians thought then, Neil Kinnock and then eventually John Smith and certainly Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and you can still see her influence in the Labour Party today, making it a much more centrist party, pro-business, much less like the Labour Party, or certainly parts of the Labour Party, back in the 60s and 1970s. Her nemesis proved to be the poll tax. This was what sounded like a straightforward reform of local government taxation. You wouldn't have thought this was a big ticket issue, but actually there were problems with the domestic rates, the local taxation system at the time. Mrs Thatcher was not originally in favour of replacing rates with the poll tax, but was convinced to do so by officials and ministers within her government after 1986, and from then on with gusto supported the introduction of a tax which proved so unpopular when it was introduced that there were riots in central London, massive no-pay campaigns in Glasgow and other cities within the UK, and crucially from her point of view led to a perception amongst Conservative MPs that she was a loser, and the Conservative Party, always lethally willing to get rid of leaders whom they think are losers, did exactly that. In 1990, in November 1990, Mrs Thatcher was unceremoniously removed as leader of the Conservative Party. John Major became leader and Prime Minister and went on to win the 1992 general election. Of course, we'll never know the counterfactual question of whether Mrs Thatcher would have won the 1991 or 2 general election, but I think it's safer to assume it was more likely that John Major would have won it than she would. What's Mrs Thatcher's legacy? Well, I think there's no question that, as Andrew Marr said in his television programme about modern history in Britain, Mrs Thatcher's legacy is changing the way almost everybody in Britain thinks about money, thinks about the economy and thinks about business. Of course, there are people who are unreconstructed on the left from the days in the 60s and 70s when people thought very differently. But I think most contemporary politicians at the top of any of our major parties today are influenced by the changes to the economy wrought by Mrs Thatcher. They now think of business, they think of the making of money and enterprise in a very different way than was true in the 60s and 70s. Having said that, there will be many Labour politicians quoted in the press, though they'll resist the temptation to go too far, but many Labour politicians privately believe that the social cohesion of Britain was altered, damaged indeed, during Mrs Thatcher's years as Prime Minister in a way that still affects the way politics functions in Britain. So, looking at all of this, Mrs Thatcher, first female British Prime Minister, an extraordinarily powerful person who dominated politics for a decade, the classic example of the politician of whom you can say, like them or loathe them, they made a difference.